Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 serves as the subject of this comprehensive analysis and explanation, where we will dissect the film's narrative architecture, character evolution, and thematic depth to understand why it stands as the most emotionally devastating entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This analysis explores how director James Gunn weaponizes audience affection for a talking raccoon to deliver a raw, operatic meditation on animal cruelty, found family, and the long shadow of childhood trauma, all while functioning as a genre-defying blockbuster that feels definitively like a final chapter. The film opens not with a space battle or a dance-off, but with a quiet, melancholic study of Peter Quill drinking himself into a stupor on Nowhere, immediately signaling that the party is over and the emotional debt of past adventures has come due with interest. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 immediately establishes its core thematic engine through Peter Quill's depressive spiral, a narrative choice that reframes the entire trilogy's emotional stakes by presenting a Star-Lord who has lost the very thing that defined him. Unlike previous films where Quill's arrested development was played for laughs, here his emotional stagnation is rendered as a hollow, almost pathetic mourning for a version of Gamora who never experienced the growth he did, trapping him in a one-sided love story that the universe has already erased. His alcoholism and inability to function without the mission of saving Gamora speaks to a deeper truth about grief. That sometimes we cling to the ghost of a relationship because letting go means admitting that the person who shaped us no longer exists in any recognizable form, a mature and unglamorous depiction of heartbreak rarely afforded to male superhero protagonists. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 introduces the High Evolutionary as perhaps the most irredeemably monstrous villain in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, a character whose evil is not born of sympathetic grievance or philosophical extremism, but of pure, cold, narcissistic obsession with perfection. Chiwetel Ejiofor's theatrical, vein-popping performance channels a specific kind of megalomania rooted in the language of scientific progress and eugenics, where living beings are reduced to batches and experiments worthy of extermination the moment they fail to meet his impossible standards. His casual destruction of Counter-Earth, an entire planet of sentient humanoid animals he deemed imperfect, serves as a horrifying escalation of villainy that dwarfs even Thanos' genocide in its pettiness. Thanos killed for what he believed was balance, but the High Evolutionary kills because he is annoyed, because his creations embarrass him, because he can. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 unfolds Rocket's backstory through a series of flashbacks that function as the emotional and moral center of the entire film, transforming what could have been a macabre origin into a deeply affecting tragedy about innocence corrupted by institutionalized cruelty. These flashbacks to Batch 89, where a baby raccoon, an otter named Lilla, a walrus named Teefs, and a rabbit named Floor dream of freedom while trapped in cages, are rendered with such tender specificity and escalating dread that they retroactively recolor every joke Rocket has ever made across 3 films as a coping mechanism for unimaginable loss. The moment young Rocket names himself, articulating his dream of building a sky for his friends to fly in, is the moment the film pivots from space opera into something closer to a prison drama, where the bars are literal cages and the warden wears a lab coat. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 deploys the death of Lilla, Teefs, and Floor as a narrative gut punch designed not to shock but to bear witness, forcing the audience to sit in the prolonged, horrific reality of creatures who loved each other being murdered for the crime of wanting to exist outside their designated purpose. Lilla's death is particularly brutal because it happens mid-hug, a reunion cut short by a gunshot, her lifeless body slumping against Rocket as the High Evolutionary mockingly asks why he grieves for vermin. This scene explicitly parallels real-world animal testing facilities where creatures capable of love, fear, and friendship are discarded as disposable research materials, and Gunn refuses to cut away, refuses to soften the blow with a quip or a heroic rescue. Because the entire point is that sometimes there is no rescue, only the memory of those we failed to save. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions Rocket's near-death experience and subsequent vision of his lost friends as a profound theological and emotional turning point, where Lilla's declaration that "your time has not yet come" functions not as a cheap fake-out death, but as a confirmation that surviving trauma carries a responsibility. In this liminal space, surrounded by the souls of those he could not protect, Rocket is granted permission to stop punishing himself, to accept that his survival was not a betrayal, but a gift that must be honored through leadership and love. This sequence, scored to an acoustic cover of Radiohead's Creep, transforms a song about self-loathing into an anthem of acceptance, as if the universe itself is telling Rocket that his perceived weirdness and damage are not disqualifications from belonging, but the very qualities that will make him a worthy captain. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 completes Nebula's astonishing character arc across the MCU by positioning her as the emotional anchor of the team, a role that would have seemed unthinkable when she was introduced as a snarling cybernetic assassin bent on sibling murder. Karen Gillan's performance captures a Nebula who has metabolized her trauma into fierce, pragmatic compassion, a character who understands suffering so intimately that she cannot help but tend to the wounded, whether that means carrying an unconscious Rocket or deciding to stay on Nowhere to raise a city of displaced children. Her evolution from a woman who only knew how to destroy to one who builds communities represents the trilogy's most radical argument: that healing is possible for even the most broken among us, and that the path to redemption runs not through heroic sacrifices, but through the daily work of showing up for others. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 grants Drax the Destroyer a conclusion that honors his comic relief status while revealing the profound emotional intelligence that has always lurked beneath his literal-minded exterior. Dave Bautista's insistence that his character find purpose beyond punchlines results in a Drax who becomes the primary caregiver for the children rescued from the High Evolutionary's ship, a father figure role that brings his trilogy-long grief over his murdered family full circle without needing to resurrect or replace them. The moment when Drax wordlessly calms a frightened child, drawing on a gentleness that his massive frame belies, is the quietest and most powerful conclusion to a revenge narrative in the MCU, suggesting that the opposite of violence is not peace but nurturing. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 introduces Adam Warlock as a fascinatingly botched creation, a character whose golden perfection masks the emotional maturity of a terrified toddler lashing out at a world he never asked to enter. While Poulter's performance leans into Warlock's naivety and confusion, a godlike being who has been weaponized by a vain mother figure, but who genuinely does not understand the consequences of his actions, making his eventual turn toward heroism feel less like a redemption arc and more like a child finally finding the right parents. His limited screen time has been criticized, but his journey from sovereign attack dog to someone who saves a life because Groot showed him a single act of mercy encapsulates the film's thesis. Cruelty is taught, but so is kindness, and the difference is the community that shapes you. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 operates on a dual narrative structure that interweaves the present-day race to save Rocket's life with the traumatic memories flooding his unconscious mind, creating a temporal conversation between cause and effect that redefines every character's motivation. The physical journey to Orgacorp and Counter-Earth becomes a metaphorical excavation of Rocket's psyche, with each piece of retrieved code corresponding to a locked-away memory that must be confronted before healing can occur. This structure allows the film to maintain relentless forward momentum while also dwelling in the stillness of trauma, a balancing act that could easily collapse into tonal chaos, but instead coheres into a unified emotional experience. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 redefines the concept of the kill switch from a simple plot device into a devastating metaphor for the lasting damage of childhood abuse, where the mechanisms of control installed by abusers can lie dormant for years before triggering self-destruction. Rocket's physical kill switch, embedded in his heart by the High Evolutionary's organization, externalizes the internal self-destruct mechanisms that trauma survivors often carry. The belief that they are fundamentally broken, unworthy of love, and destined to hurt those who get close. The override code is not a technological solution but an act of collective love, the Guardians' refusal to let Rocket die functioning as the emotional counter-programming that finally disarms the abuser's last hold on his victim's psyche. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the alternate timeline Gamora as a bold narrative gambit that refuses easy romantic resolution, insisting instead that Peter Quill must accept the permanent loss of his Gamora, even while a version of her walks and fights alongside him. Zoe Saldana plays this Gamora as harder-edged and less patient, a Ravager who owes the Guardians nothing and finds Quill's longing glances irritating rather than endearing, a characterization choice that prevents audiences from viewing her as a consolation prize. Their final scene together, where she acknowledges she can see why her other self loved him but affirms she is not that person, represents a startlingly mature resolution for a blockbuster romance, allowing both characters to move forward without diminishing what was lost. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 culminates in the rescue of children and animals from the High Evolutionary's ship, a sequence that transforms the standard third-act superhero battle into a humanitarian crisis response that prioritizes saving lives over punching villains. The image of Drax, Nebula, and Mantis coaxing three monstrous obelisks into becoming allies rather than enemies encapsulates the entire trilogy's ethos. Creatures labeled dangerous or expendable by the powerful are deserving of patience, understanding, and love. This sequence, with its Noah's Ark of bewildered animals and terrified children spilling into the corridors of nowhere, argues that heroism is not measured in defeated enemies, but in lives preserved, a rebuke to the body count logic of most superhero climaxes. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 makes the unexpected choice to have Rocket spare the High Evolutionary's life, a decision that initially frustrates but ultimately reveals the thematic sophistication at the film's core. Killing his creator would complete a traditional revenge narrative, but Rocket has spent his entire existence defined by the High Evolutionary's violence. To respond with more violence would be to remain trapped in that dynamic. By choosing mercy, or at least refusal to execute, Rocket declares his own moral independence, proving that he is not the monster his creator tried to make him, but a being capable of breaking cycles, a choice that Lila's spirit implicitly endorses as the true meaning of his second chance. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 closes Peter Quill's arc by sending him back to Earth to reunite with his grandfather, a full-circle journey that began when a boy was abducted from a Missouri hospital parking lot and told his mother's death meant he had no home left. This homecoming is not a defeat or a regression, but an acknowledgement that healing requires confronting the wounds we ran from, and Chris Pratt's performance in the final scene. A man terrified to knock on an old man's door, unsure if he deserves a family that exists outside of crisis, grounds the cosmic epic in the simple, profound act of coming home. The film argues that Quill had to lose everything, including his identity as Star-Lord, before he could find the courage to be Peter Jason Quill again. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions Mantis's departure from the team as a declaration of selfhood, a character who has always been defined in relation to others, Ego's servant, Drax's companion, the team's empath, finally choosing to discover who she is when no one else is defining her. Her decision to walk into the unknown with three obelisks as her companions is both ridiculous and deeply moving, a former weapon of a narcissistic god choosing to explore the galaxy on her own terms, guided only by curiosity and a newfound sense of agency. This arc validates the experiences of those who have spent their lives managing others' emotions, insisting that caregiving is not a permanent obligation, but a role from which one can and must eventually graduate to self-care. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 leaves Nebula and Drax in charge of Nowhere's displaced children, a pairing that reimagines two of the trilogy's most violence-defined characters as community builders who will raise the next generation away from the cruelty that shaped them. Nebula's cybernetic precision and Drax's unexpected tenderness combine into a parenting dynamic that the film never mocks, instead treating their commitment to these children as the most heroic act either could perform. This is a quiet revolution in superhero storytelling. The warrior and the assassin lay down their weapons not to die gloriously, but to live meaningfully, their battlefield transformed into a nursery where no child will be called vermin or obsolete. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 elevates Groot's final line to a moment of transcendent narrative payoff, as the audience, after years of only hearing, "I am Groot," is suddenly granted the ability to understand his words when he says, "I love you guys." This is not a diegetic linguistic shift, but a fourth-wall-breaking gift from James Gunn to the audience. A confirmation that we have become part of this family too, that our investment and empathy over 3 films have earned us the right to finally understand. It is a sentimental choice that could easily feel manipulative, but in context functions as an earned catharsis, the emotional Rosetta Stone that retroactively clarifies every "I am Groot" we have ever heard as a declaration of love. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 introduces Cosmo the space dog as more than comic relief, transforming a Soviet-era telekinetic canine into a fully realized member of the found family whose powers prove essential to the rescue mission. Cosmo's arc from being called a bad dog to being recognized as a good dog mirrors Rocket's journey in miniature, another creature experimented upon and discarded who finds purpose and validation through community. The film's refusal to treat Cosmo as a joke character, Her telekinetic tunneling through the High Evolutionary's ship is rendered with the same visual gravity as any superhero power display. Reflects the trilogy's consistent ethic that all life, regardless of species or origin, deserves dignity and recognition. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the Counter-Earth setting to explore a twisted utopianism. A 1980s inflected planet populated by anthropomorphic animals living what appears to be an idyllic suburban existence that masks the horrifying reality of their status as the High Evolutionary's latest disposable experiment. The retro aesthetic, the cars, the clothing, the architecture, evokes a nostalgia that curdles upon closer inspection, a false paradise where every smiling citizen is one evaluation away from extermination. This visual design choice externalizes the film's critique of nostalgic perfectionism itself, suggesting that the desire to create an ideal society always carries within it the seeds of totalitarian violence against anyone deemed imperfect. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features a one-take action sequence that serves as a technical showcase and a narrative statement, the camera flowing seamlessly from character to character as they battle through the corridors of Arret, each Guardian's fighting style expressing their personality without a single cut to break the immersion. This sequence, achieved through meticulous choreography and digital stitching, represents the trilogy at its collaborative peak. Not a series of individual hero moments, but a collective dance where every move depends on the move before it, a visual metaphor for the team's interdependence. The technical ambition of this shot also serves as a farewell from James Gunn to the action filmmaking style he helped popularize, a final flex before moving on to shepherd an entire cinematic universe elsewhere. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features John Murphy's score as a quiet but essential contributor to the film's emotional architecture, replacing Tyler Bates while maintaining continuity with the trilogy's established sonic identity. Murphy's central theme for Rocket carries a mournful, ascending quality that suggests both the pain of the past and the possibility of transcendence, while the licensed soundtrack selections function as emotional shorthand for the characters' inner states. The use of rainbows since you've been gone, Space Hogs in the meantime, and especially Florence and the Machine's Dog Days Are Over, during the climactic celebration creates a mixtape logic that feels personal and curated rather than algorithmically generated for maximum nostalgia extraction. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 makes the bold structural decision to position its most emotionally devastating material in flashbacks featuring CGI animals with human voices, a creative risk that could easily have tipped into absurdity, but instead produces the most sincerely moving sequences in any Marvel film. The character design for Lilla, Teefs, and Floor walks a careful line between anthropomorphic expressiveness and animal authenticity, their mechanical limbs and modifications serving as constant visual reminders of the violations they have endured. These creatures are never cute in the way that undermines their tragedy. They are heartbreaking specifically because their modifications cannot hide their essential animal innocence, making their fates feel like violations of something sacred. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 depicts the High Evolutionary's face being mauled by an enraged young Rocket, a moment of shocking violence that the film treats not as cathartic revenge, but as the birth of a trauma that will define both characters for decades. The High Evolutionary's subsequent mask, which he wears throughout the present-day narrative, literalizes his performative humanity. Beneath the cultured demeanor of a visionary scientist lies a monstrous visage created by his own cruelty. This visual choice also serves as a dark parallel to Rocket's own masking of his pain behind sarcasm and aggression. Two creatures shaped by the same violent encounter who took opposite paths. One toward domination, the other toward connection. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 incorporates the Sovereign's revenge plot as a narrative catalyst rather than a central conflict, using Aisha's creation of Adam Warlock to trigger the crisis that exposes Rocket's kill switch and sets the entire plot in motion. This choice reflects James Gunn's understanding that the Sovereign were never interesting as primary antagonists. Their golden pomposity works best in small doses, and that their real narrative function was to birth Adam Warlock into the MCU with the emotional confusion of a weapon who might someday choose not to be one. Aisha's death in the destruction of Counter-Earth is almost an afterthought, a loose end tied off without ceremony, because the film correctly understands that her story was never the point. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 treats Nowhere as a character in its own right, the severed celestial head transformed from a lawless mining colony into a bustling community that represents everything the High Evolutionary despises. organic, chaotic, and defiantly imperfect. The visual design of Nowhere in this film emphasizes its lived-in quality, the accumulated detritus of countless species coexisting in a space that was never meant to house life but has been reclaimed by it. This setting functions as a counterargument to the high evolutionary sterile vision, a proof of concept that messy, diverse, unplanned communities can thrive precisely because of their imperfections rather than despite them. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 reunites the Guardians after the events of Avengers. Endgame and Thor, Love and Thunder have scattered them across different narrative corners of the MCU, a logistical challenge that Gunn navigates by treating the team's fragmentation as a natural consequence of their traumatic experiences rather than a problem to be quickly solved. The film allows these characters to have drifted apart, to have changed in each other's absence. And the process of reassembling the team becomes a process of rediscovering why they chose each other in the first place. This approach honors the passage of time and the reality that even found families require maintenance and recommitment, not just a single declaration of loyalty. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops the Guardians' infiltration of Orgacorp as a body horror heist sequence that visually distinguishes the High Evolutionaries Empire from any other location in the MCU. Its organic architecture resembling the interior of a living creature that has been hollowed out and repurposed for industrial efficiency. The fleshy, pulsing walls and the grotesque hum-animal experiments glimpsed in the background create an atmosphere of institutionalized nightmare that communicates the film's anti-vivisection message without needing to pause for speeches. This is a place where life is processed rather than lived, a factory that consumes animals and outputs products, and the visual language of the production design ensures the audience never forgets the horror underlying the scientific veneer. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features Kraglin's continued struggle to master Yondu's fin and arrow as a running subplot that honors Michael Rooker's absence, while allowing Sean Gunn to develop Kraglin beyond comic relief into a character genuinely grappling with legacy and competence. The moment when Kraglin finally uses the arrow effectively during the climactic rescue, his shriek of triumph echoing Yondu's signature whistle, functions as a passing of the torch that is both ridiculous and sincerely moving. This subplot also reinforces the theme that skills must be earned through practice and failure, not granted through shortcuts or genetic enhancement. A direct rebuke to the high evolutionaries' methods of imposing perfection rather than allowing growth. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 introduces Phyla, one of the high evolutionaries' child prisoners, as a quiet but significant addition to the MCU's cosmic landscape. A character whose comic book history as Phyla-Vell suggests a future that the film itself declines to foreground. Her presence among the rescued children and her positioning in the mid-credits scene as part of the new Guardians team plants seeds that other storytellers may or may not harvest, but within the context of Volume 3 her function is simpler. She is living proof that the high evolutionaries' victims can escape and thrive. Every child the Guardians save is a refutation of the villain's entire philosophy, and Phyla's wide-eyed wonder at her own rescue is the film's most optimistic image. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 utilizes practical effects and animatronics for many of its creature characters, a choice that James Gunn has discussed as essential to maintaining tactile reality in a film where the emotional stakes depend on audiences believing in the physical existence of beings like Teefs and Floor. The hybrid approach, practical puppets enhanced by digital animation, creates a tangibility that pure CGI often lacks, allowing actors to perform against real objects and giving the animal characters a weight and presence that anchors the more fantastical elements in sensory reality. This commitment to practical effects also reflects the film's thematic investment in the material, embodied reality of creatures the high evolutionary would reduce to disposable data points. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 navigates the challenge of being the 32nd MCU film by operating with a remarkable degree of narrative independence, referencing previous events only when necessary for character motivation rather than burdening itself with franchise connectivity. The film does not set up Kong, does not tease secret wars, does not introduce multiversal mechanics. It tells a complete, self-contained story about a group of characters saying goodbye to each other and to their shared past. In an era of interconnected franchise storytelling that often feels like homework, Volume 3's willingness to simply conclude rather than advertise creates a sense of finality that gives every emotional beat additional weight, because we understand that this really is the end of something. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features Rocket's acceptance of the captaincy as the final stage of his character arc. A position he initially rejects because he still sees himself as the damaged experiment who got his friends killed rather than the leader his friends have always followed. His journey from self-loathing isolation to captaincy mirrors the trilogy's larger argument about leadership. True leaders are not those without scars, but those whose scars have taught them the value of the lives they protect. When Rocket finally looks at the new team roster and accepts his role, it completes a transformation that began with a caged raccoon who only wanted to build a sky and ends with a captain who will ensure no one under his command ever feels caged again. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 builds its third act around a massive, chaotic rescue operation rather than a traditional boss fight, a structural subversion that redefines what superhero climax can look like. The Guardians split up not to defeat the High Evolutionary in combat, but to save everyone they can before his ship explodes. Their heroism measured in the lives they extract rather than the punches they land. This choice aligns with the film's moral framework, which consistently values protection over destruction. And the image of the team ferrying cages of terrified animals through collapsing corridors is a more potent refutation of the villain's ideology than any physical defeat could provide. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 includes a moment where Mantis communicates with the Abelisks and discovers they are not monsters but traumatized creatures who have been abused into aggression, a revelation that transforms three potential obstacles into allies and reinforces the film's thesis about the difference between nature and conditioning. This scene, which could have been played as a joke, is instead treated with the same emotional seriousness as any character's backstory revelation, extending empathy to creatures that most blockbusters would treat as disposable enemies. The Abelisks' eventual escape alongside the Guardians becomes another data point in the film's argument that no creature is beyond redemption if someone is willing to understand them. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gives Nebula a moment of emotional vulnerability when she admits she was happy to be part of the Guardians because she finally had friends, a confession that would have been unthinkable from the character who once tried to murder her sister out of jealousy. This admission, delivered without self-pity, reveals how completely Nebula has integrated her experiences into a functional selfhood, acknowledging her past misery without being defined by it. Karen Gillan's performance in this moment is understated, almost matter-of-fact, because Nebula is not seeking sympathy but simply stating a truth that she has earned the right to articulate. She was alone, and now she is not, and that change is the most important fact of her existence. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 explores the theme of bodily autonomy through its depiction of the high evolutionary's experiments, which strip creatures of consent over their own physical forms in the name of improvement. Rocket's cybernetic implants, Lila's mechanical arms, Tief's wheels, and Floor's facial modifications are all violations imposed without consent, permanent reminders of a creator who viewed his subjects as objects to be optimized rather than beings with rights. The film's insistence that these modifications are traumatic rather than empowering distinguishes it from the transhumanist fantasies of many superhero narratives, arguing that the right to determine one's own body is fundamental, and that its violation constitutes a profound moral harm regardless of the violator's intentions. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 includes a sequence where the Guardians argue about their various personal dramas while navigating a life-threatening crisis, a verbal chaos, that captures the trilogy's signature tonal blend of interpersonal comedy and genuine peril. These arguments about Gamera's coldness, about Mantis's independence, about who is allowed to sacrifice themselves, are not interruptions of the action but the action itself, the team's dysfunction and love operating simultaneously in a dynamic that has defined the Guardians since their first prison break. Gunn understands that these characters express affection through bickering, and the film allows their final mission together to be filled with the same exasperated love that has always characterized their interactions. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions the High Evolutionary's Counter-Earth genocide as the moment that clarifies his villainy beyond any ambiguity, a planetary destruction rendered in horrifying wide shots that show neighborhoods, families, and entire civilizations obliterated in minutes because their creator found them aesthetically displeasing. This sequence is a direct cinematic citation of real-world eugenics movements and their catastrophic consequences, the language of imperfect specimens and failed experiments, echoing the rhetoric of historical atrocities that Gunn refuses to sanitize for entertainment purposes. The fact that the High Evolutionary does this casually, without visible emotion beyond frustration, makes the sequence more disturbing than any emotional outburst could, because it reveals that for him, Mass death is simply pest control. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops Rocket's relationship with his own species identification, finally accepting that he is a raccoon after years of deflecting the label with defensiveness and denial. This acceptance is not played for laughs, but as a profound moment of self-recognition, Rocket claiming an identity that was weaponized against him and transforming it into a source of pride. The journey from, "I'm not a raccoon," to silently acknowledging his reflection represents the psychological work of embracing the self that trauma tried to destroy, and Bradley Cooper's vocal performance in the film's quieter moments conveys a raccoon finally at peace with what he is, because what he is has proven worthy of love. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the Zune MP3 player as an evolving symbol of Quill's emotional state, the gift from Yondu that represents his connection to his late father figure and his acceptance of Earth technology that postdates his abduction. The Zune's presence in this film, filled with music from the 1980s and 1990s, represents Quill's arrested relationship with his home planet. He has accepted the music, but not the return, and his eventual decision to go back to Earth completes this symbolic arc. The device that played father and son during Yondu's funeral has now played the soundtrack to Quill's final adventure, and passing it to Rocket represents a handing off of not just captaincy, but the emotional burden of carrying Earth's music across the stars. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features a mid-credits scene that assembles the new Guardians lineup as a promise that the franchise concept can continue without the original cast. But the scene's tone is notably lighter and more comic than the emotional weight of the preceding 2+ hours. Rocket leading a team that includes an adolescent Groot, Kraglin with his mastered arrow, Cosmo the telekinetic dog, Adam Warlock and his pet Blurp, and the rescued Phyla suggests a future that could be fun, but feels intentionally less mythic than what came before. This is not a weakness, but a conscious lowering of stakes, allowing the audience to imagine further adventures without demanding that they must be as emotionally significant as the story that just concluded. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 delivers a post-credits scene that reveals Peter Quill eating cereal with his grandfather on Earth, a domestic image so mundane and warm that it reframes the entire galactic saga as a very long detour on the way to breakfast with family. This scene, which includes a brief conversation about the grandfather's neighbor mowing the lawn, is James Gunn's final statement on Quill's character. The cosmic hero was always a small-town boy who missed his mom, and returning to that original wound with the courage to heal it is a braver act than any space battle. The scene's quietness, its refusal to set up anything, is its power, a period at the end of a very long sentence. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 engages with the concept of the afterlife through Rocket's near-death vision, but it carefully avoids doctrinal specificity, presenting the reunion with Lilla, Teefs, and Floor as a space that could be heaven, could be a dying brain's final comfort, or could be a genuine cosmic gift from a universe that finally owes Rocket a moment of peace. This ambiguity allows the scene to function for audiences across belief systems while maintaining emotional integrity, the point being not the mechanics of the afterlife, but the moral clarity it provides. Rocket's time has not yet come, and he must return to the living because his story is not finished. Lilla's role as Psychopomp, the friend who sends him back, completes her narrative function as the companion who always believed Rocket was destined for more than a cage. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 depicts the High Evolutionary's ultimate fate. Defeated, dragged away by his own creations, his face unmasked and ruined, as a living punishment rather than a satisfying execution. The decision to keep him alive, imprisoned in the very systems of exploitation he created, carries a poetic justice that death would not provide. He must exist now as a failure, his perfectionist ideology refuted by the survival of those he deemed imperfect. This resolution also preserves the character for potential future use, while closing his role in this particular story definitively, a balance between franchise logic and narrative satisfaction that Gunn navigates with characteristic pragmatism. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was shot by cinematographer Henry Braham using large-format RED cameras that capture the practical sets and actor performances with a clarity that serves the film's emotional realism despite its cosmic setting. The color palette shifts deliberately between the cold, sterile blues and whites of Orgacorp and Counter-Earth's false nostalgia to the warm, saturated chaos of Nowhere and the Guardian's ship, creating visual differentiation between spaces of control and spaces of freedom. This cinematographic language supports the narrative without calling attention to itself, a mature visual approach that trusts the audience to absorb atmospheric information subconsciously while focusing on character. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 represents James Gunn's farewell to the Marvel Cinematic Universe before assuming leadership of DC Studios, a departure that infuses the film with a metatextual quality of goodbye that operates independently of the narrative content. The care with which every original Guardian receives a defined ending suggests a creator tidying his narrative house before handing over the keys, ensuring that no subsequent filmmaker can undo the closure he has provided. This is not possessiveness but generosity, a recognition that these characters deserve conclusions and that the audience deserves to see them, rather than an endless churn of sequels that never allow finality. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 treats its 150-minute runtime as necessary real estate for the emotional arcs it needs to complete, though some sequences, particularly the extended infiltration of Orgacorp, could bear tightening without losing impact. The length is most justified in the Rocket flashbacks, which require the audience to dwell in his suffering to understand its depth, and in the extended denouement, which honors each character's ending rather than rushing to credits. The film's pacing issues are the acceptable cost of its ambition. This is a story that needed to be long because it had many goodbyes to say, and truncating any of them would have diminished the catharsis. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 continues the trilogy's tradition of using popular music as an emotional and narrative tool. But the song selections here are noticeably more melancholic and less ironic than previous installments, reflecting the film's more serious register. The acoustic cover of Creep that accompanies Rocket's afterlife sequence strips away the original's self-pitying sneer to reveal a raw confession of unworthiness that perfectly captures Rocket's lifelong struggle with self-acceptance. Dog Days Are Over by Florence and the Machine, which plays over the epilogue, functions as both celebration and benediction, a promise that the happiness the characters have found is real and deserved rather than a setup for the next tragedy. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features a supporting performance from Maria Bakalova as the voice of Cosmo, bringing a Russian-accented sincerity to a character who could easily have been a throwaway joke. Cosmo's telekinetic abilities are used creatively throughout the film, but her most important function is emotional. She is another foundling adopted by the Guardians' extended family, another creature with strange powers who finds acceptance rather than exploitation. Her repeated desire to be called a good dog is played for laughs but carries the same weight as Rocket's need for validation, a smaller echo of the film's central theme that all beings crave recognition from those they love. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 incorporates the destruction of the High Evolutionary's ship as a practical consequence of the rescue mission rather than a strategic objective, the Guardians' goal being extraction rather than demolition. The ship's destruction is a byproduct of chaos and the High Evolutionary's own hubris, not a calculated strike, which maintains the film's moral distinction between the Guardians' protective violence and the villain's creative destruction. When the ship finally explodes, it takes with it the physical infrastructure of torture, but not the memory, a realistic acknowledgement that destroying the apparatus of cruelty does not erase its effects on survivors. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gives Drax a moment of linguistic transcendence during the climax when he communicates with the children in his care not through his characteristic literalism, but through a gentle, metaphorical reassurance that the monsters are gone and they are safe. This moment suggests that Drax's literalism has always been partly performative, a way of navigating a galaxy that hurt him by refusing to engage with its nuances, and that fatherhood has unlocked in him a capacity for figurative comfort that he reserved for his original family. Dave Bautista's performance in this scene, soft and certain, is the culmination of an actor's long campaign to make his character more than comic relief. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions the High Evolutionary's relationship with Rocket as a dark perversion of the creator-creation bond, where the creator's recognition of his creation's brilliance leads not to pride, but to exploitation and eventual attempted destruction. The High Evolutionary's obsession with reclaiming Rocket's brain, the one experiment that exceeded his expectations and therefore threatened his narrative of total control, reveals his fundamental insecurity beneath the God-complex posturing. He cannot allow Rocket to exist independently because Rocket's independent existence proves that the creator is not necessary, that creations can surpass and repudiate their makers. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 explores the concept of home as a portable, relational construct rather than a geographical location, with nowhere serving as the physical manifestation of this idea. The severed head of a dead god, drifting through space and populated by refugees, is as far from a traditional home as imaginable, yet it becomes the site of the film's most stable domestic arrangements. Nebula and Drax choosing to remain on Nowhere to raise children suggests that home is wherever care is provided, a final rejection of the high evolutionarist belief that environments must be perfected before life can flourish within them. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 includes a scene where Peter Quill finally reads the note that Gamora left him before her death, a moment of private grief that the film grants space to exist without undercutting. The contents of the note are less important than the act of reading it, Quill's willingness to finally face the last words of the woman he lost rather than drowning her memory in alcohol and denial. This scene, quiet and still in a film of chaos, represents the turning point in Quill's grief narrative, the moment when mourning begins to transform into memory, a process the film respects enough to depict without rushing. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 engages with the ethics of creation through its contrast between the high evolutionarist biological engineering and the Guardians' emotional investment in each other. The villain creates life through science but destroys it through negligence. The heroes create family through choice and sustain it through sacrifice. This parallel argues that the act of making something alive carries with it an ongoing obligation of care, a responsibility that extends beyond the moment of creation into the entire lifespan of the created. The high evolutionarist's willingness to discard his creations is the moral failure that defines him, while the Guardians' refusal to abandon each other is the moral achievement that redeems them. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features the final appearance of Sylvester Stallone's Stakar Ogord and the original Ravager crew in a brief but meaningful cameo that honors the connective tissue between Gunn's films. Their presence during the rescue operation serves as a visual acknowledgement that the Guardians' ethos of found family extends beyond the core team to a larger network of spacefaring misfits who show up when needed. This cameo also provides continuity with Volume 2's post-credits scenes, closing a loop that could easily have been forgotten in the crowded MCU tapestry. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 treats Groot's physical transformation, now a muscular adolescent tree being, as a reflection of his emotional growth from the infant of Volume 2 to a young adult capable of complex heroism and self-sacrifice. The character design for this iteration of Groot emphasizes his physical capability while retaining the expressive face that allows Vin Diesel's three-word vocabulary to convey an entire emotional range. His rescue of various characters during the climax, using his extending limbs to snatch allies from danger, demonstrates a protective instinct that has matured beyond the simple violence of his earlier forms, a Groot who saves rather than destroys. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 makes the surprising choice to separate its romantic leads permanently, with Peter Quill and the alternate Gamora acknowledging that their relationship cannot and should not be rekindled. This resolution, which denies the audience the romantic reunion that 3 films of investment might seem to demand, is the bravest narrative choice in a film full of them, insisting that some losses are permanent and that healthy love sometimes means letting someone go. The alternate Gamora's final words to Quill, that she can see why her other self loved him, is the closest thing to closure their story can offer, a bittersweet acknowledgement that honors what was lost without pretending it can be recovered. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 showcases Will Poulter's physical transformation into Adam Warlock as a commitment that matches the character's in-universe artificial perfection, his gold-skinned, muscular frame radiating the uncanny valley of a being created rather than born. Poulter's performance choices, the uncertain pauses, the childlike processing of complex social situations, prevents Warlock from becoming the stoic badass audiences might have expected, instead creating a character whose power is inversely proportional to his emotional intelligence. This Warlock is a work in progress, and the film's willingness to leave him unfinished is a promise rather than a failure. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the concept of Batch 89, the designation given to Rocket, Lilla, Teefs, and Floor, as a dehumanizing label that the film systematically dismantles by revealing the rich interior lives and relationships of those it attempts to categorize. Each number in the batch corresponds to a fully realized individual with dreams, fears, and the capacity for love, making the clinical designation feel obscene by the time the flashbacks reach their tragic conclusion. The high evolutionarist's use of batch numbers is the linguistic equivalent of his physical experiments, an attempt to reduce beings to data that the film's narrative structure explicitly refutes by granting those beings subjectivity and voice. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions the character of Thiel, the High Evolutionary's record keeper, as a chilling example of bureaucratic evil, a functionary who participates in genocide through record-keeping and code maintenance without ever wielding a weapon himself. His death, the Guardians retrieving the kill switch override code from his corpse, is handled without ceremony or satisfaction, a disposal rather than a kill, because the film understands that Thiel was never the point. The real monster was always the one giving orders, and the functionaries who enable him are merely obstacles to be navigated rather than villains to be vanquished. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gives Rocket a final confrontation with the High Evolutionary that reverses their original power dynamic, the creation now standing over the creator with the power of life and death in his hands. Rocket's decision to spare the High Evolutionary is accompanied by the memory of Lila's voice telling him that his time has not yet come, a narrative suggestion that mercy is a gift from the dead to the living, a refusal to continue the cycle that killed them. This choice has been criticized as anticlimactic by some viewers, but it represents the film's most sophisticated argument. That true victory over an abuser is not destruction but indifference, the refusal to let the abuser's values determine one's own actions, even in the moment of ultimate power. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 incorporates the Zune's final song as a diegetic farewell to the audience, the music that has defined the trilogy playing out over images of the characters moving toward their separate futures. The song choice, Florence and the Machine's Dog Days Are Over, is a secular benediction that explicitly promises happiness is not only possible but present, that the suffering the characters have endured is not the final word on their existence. This musical choice, combined with the visual montage of characters finding their new paths, creates the emotional equivalent of a curtain call, a moment for the audience to process the journey before the lights come up. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 leaves the door open for future Guardians stories with its new lineup, while also making clear that the story of the original Guardians is definitively complete, a balancing act that respects both franchise economics and narrative integrity. The new team, Rocket, Adolescent Groot, Kraglin, Cosmo, Adam Warlock, Phyla, and Blurp, has enough established personality to sustain interest while lacking the specific chemistry that made the original lineup so beloved. This is not a failure of imagination, but an honest acknowledgement that some alchemies cannot be replicated, and that future Guardians stories will need to find their own identity rather than attempting to recreate what has ended. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 functions as a critique of perfectionism across multiple registers: aesthetic, scientific, social, arguing that the pursuit of flawless existence leads inevitably to destruction while the acceptance of imperfection enables growth and connection. The High Evolutionary's perfect counter-Earth is an abomination of control, while the Guardians' messy, bickering, trauma-scarred family is a paradise of mutual acceptance. This argument extends beyond the narrative into the film's aesthetic choices, which embrace practical imperfection and tonal chaos over the polished uniformity of lesser blockbusters, modeling the values it preaches through its own construction. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features the death of the High Evolutionary's recorder Vim, a character played by Miriam Shore whose function as the villain's conscience ends when he casually executes her for questioning his methods. This death, quick and unceremonious, underscores the High Evolutionary's inability to tolerate even the mildest dissent, his god complex requiring absolute validation from every subordinate. Vim's arc, from loyal servant to horrified witness to corpse, is a compressed version of the film's warning about enabling abusive authority, a caution that those who serve monsters will eventually be consumed by them. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 concludes with Rocket assuming leadership of the Guardians and reading from the captain's log, a full-circle moment that transforms the character who once mocked Quill's pretensions into the very thing he ridiculed. Bradley Cooper's voice in these final moments carries a new weight, a calm authority that Rocket has earned through suffering and survival rather than bluster and aggression. The film's final image of Rocket leading his team into the unknown, finally comfortable in his own fur, is a victory lap for a character who began his cinematic life as a bounty hunter's experiment and ends it as a hero worthy of the title Captain. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 establishes its emotional stakes through Rocket's near-fatal injury, a narrative catalyst that transforms the film from a hangout comedy into a desperate race against time, where every second of delay carries the weight of irreversible loss. The kill switch embedded in Rocket's chest represents the long arm of childhood abusers reaching into the present, a technological manifestation of how trauma can lie dormant for decades before threatening to destroy everything the survivor has built. Bradley Cooper's vocal performance during Rocket's unconsciousness communicates vulnerability through labored breathing and pained whimpers that remind audiences this wisecracking mercenary is, at his core, a wounded animal who never received proper care. The medpac's failing to heal Rocket because his biology has been deliberately sabotaged by his creator externalizes the film's thesis that some wounds cannot be treated with surface-level solutions, requiring instead a journey to the source of the damage itself. When the Guardians realize they must infiltrate Orgacorp to retrieve the override code, the mission structure shifts from reactive defense to proactive investigation, forcing the team to confront not just a villain, but an entire institutional system of cruelty that produced their friends' suffering. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 reveals Rocket's origin through a series of memories that function as a psychological autopsy, each flashback peeling back another layer of the defensive sarcasm that has defined the character since his first appearance. The baby raccoon discovered by the High Evolutionaries agents is not yet the cynical genius audiences know, but a terrified, curious infant whose first instinct upon meeting other caged creatures is to seek connection rather than isolation. This characterization rewrites Rocket's entire history by suggesting his standoffish personality was learned behavior, an adaptive response to a world that punished vulnerability with violence and rewarded emotional distance with survival. The flashbacks are rendered with a soft, almost dreamlike visual quality that contrasts sharply with the harsh industrial lighting of the present-day action, creating a sensory distinction between the innocence of memory and the brutality of recollection. Gunn's decision to reveal Rocket's backstory only in the final film of the trilogy demonstrates remarkable narrative patience, trusting that audiences would remain invested in a character whose pain was always visible in his actions even when its source remained mysterious. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops the friendship between young Rocket and Lila as the emotional fulcrum upon which the entire trilogy balances, a relationship so tender and hopeful that its destruction retroactively explains every self-destructive choice Rocket has ever made. Lila's mechanical arms, which should be symbols of violation, become instruments of comfort as she reaches through cage bars to hold Rocket during moments of fear, transforming the tools of her oppression into extensions of her love. Her dream of seeing the sky, articulated with the wonder of a being who has only known fluorescent lights and metal ceilings, gives Rocket his first aspirational goal. Not revenge or freedom for himself alone, but the creation of a world where his friends can experience beauty. Linda Cardellini's vocal performance as Lila carries a maternal warmth that positions her as Rocket's first and most important attachment figure, the source of the security that was violently severed and that he has spent his entire subsequent life unconsciously seeking to recover. When Lila tells Rocket that his time has not yet come during his near-death experience, she is repeating a promise she implicitly made in their cage days, that he is destined for more than suffering, and that she believes in his future even when he cannot believe in it himself. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 presents Teefs the Walrus as a character whose gentle nature survives despite physical modifications that could have embittered him, his wheels allowing mobility that his natural body would not permit, while his spirit remains untouched by the cruelty that enabled his transformation. Teefs's friendship with Floor, the rabbit whose mechanical mouthpiece and antennae render her almost unrecognizable as a rabbit, demonstrates that connection can flourish even when communication is difficult and bodies have been altered beyond their original forms. These two characters, whose screen time is limited but whose impact is devastating, represent the countless victims of experimentation whose stories are never told, whose names are never recorded, and whose deaths are processed as data rather than loss. The film grants them the dignity of full characterization despite their brief appearances, ensuring that when they die, audiences feel the weight of each death as a personal tragedy rather than a plot point. Their final moments, reaching toward each other as gunfire erupts, crystallize the film's argument that love persists even in the final seconds, that the connections forged in trauma are real connections, and that murder is murder regardless of whether the victims walk on two legs or four. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 choreographs the death of Batch 89 with the precision of a horror film, each kill occurring rapidly enough to shock, but slowly enough to register, forcing audiences to witness, rather than look away. Lila's death comes first, a gunshot delivered moments after Rocket's joyful reunion hug, the abruptness of the violence creating a disorientation that mirrors Rocket's own psychological fracturing. Teefs and Floor die in the chaos that follows, their bodies caught in crossfire they never asked to be part of, collateral damage in a conflict between their friend and their tormentor. The High Evolutionary's mockery of Rocket's grief, asking why he mourns creatures he dismisses as vermin, articulates the dehumanization that enables cruelty, the linguistic violence that precedes physical violence by categorizing victims as unworthy of empathy. Rocket's subsequent attack on the High Evolutionary, mauling his face with the ferocity of a creature who has nothing left to lose, represents the birth of the defensive rage that will characterize his interactions with the universe for decades to come. This sequence is the psychological ground zero of the entire Guardians trilogy, the event that explains everything about Rocket's behavior while refusing to excuse his cruelties, presenting trauma as explanation rather than justification. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 structures its present-day narrative around the team's infiltration of Orgacorp, a sequence that transforms the Guardians from reactive defenders into proactive investigators, navigating a bureaucratic nightmare of organic architecture and institutional cruelty. The design of Orgacorp headquarters, with its fleshy walls and pulsing corridors, visually communicates the corporation's treatment of living beings as raw materials to be processed, a factory where the product is modified life and the byproduct is corpses. The team's various approaches to infiltration, Quill and Groot's direct assault, Nebula's tactical precision, Drax and Mantis's protective guardianship of Rocket's body, reflect their individual personalities while serving the collective goal, a demonstration of functional teamwork that has evolved over 3 films. The discovery that Thiel, the record keeper, has taken the override code to Counter-Earth shifts the mission from infiltration to pursuit, raising the stakes by forcing the Guardians to enter the High Evolutionary's personal domain. This location change also introduces the film's most ambitious world building, a planet that initially appears idyllic but reveals its horrors upon closer inspection, a suburban nightmare dressed in the aesthetics of 1980s Americana. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 renders Counter-Earth as a disturbing simulacrum of human civilization, its anthropomorphic animal citizens living in tract houses, driving period-appropriate vehicles, and performing normality while existing as the High Evolutionaries. Latest experiment in social engineering. The 1980s aesthetic, the hairstyles, the fashion, the consumer products, creates an uncanny valley effect where everything looks familiar but feels fundamentally wrong. A civilization that has been designed rather than developed, populated by beings who have no cultural memory because their culture was imposed. The hum-animals of Counter-Earth are unaware of their status as experimental subjects, their ignorance a form of cruelty that denies them even the dignity of understanding their own condition. When the High Evolutionary destroys this planet because he deems it imperfect, the genocide is compounded by the victims' incomprehension. They die not understanding why, not knowing they were experiments, not realizing their lives were always provisional. This sequence critiques the utopian impulse itself, arguing that attempts to engineer perfect societies always produce mechanisms for eliminating those who fail to meet specifications, the definition of perfection requiring the identification and destruction of imperfection. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops Peter Quill's arc by forcing him to confront the High Evolutionary without the emotional armor of his usual humor, a stripped-down confrontation that reveals the seriousness beneath Star-Lord's performative irreverence. Chris Pratt's performance in this sequence drops the charming rogue persona almost entirely, replacing it with a righteous fury that Quill has rarely been allowed to express, his anger at the High Evolutionary's casual genocide, channeling his larger grief over Gamora into focused moral outrage. The High Evolutionary's condescending dismissal of Quill, treating him as just another imperfect specimen unworthy of serious engagement, establishes a class of villainy that does not recognize the hero as a legitimate opponent, an arrogance that ultimately contributes to his defeat. Quill's arc across the trilogy, from selfish thief to sacrificial hero to depressed survivor, culminates in this confrontation where he acts not for personal gain or romantic rescue, but for the protection of children and animals he has never met. His decision to leave the Guardians at the film's conclusion and return to Earth is earned by this selflessness, a recognition that his heroic journey has reached its natural endpoint and that further adventures would be avoidance rather than growth. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 grants Gamora a character journey independent of Quill's emotional needs, establishing the alternate timeline version as a fully realized individual with her own history, loyalties, and emotional boundaries that cannot be violated by Quill's nostalgia. Zoe Saldana distinguishes this Gamora from her predecessor through subtle performance choices. A harder edge to her voice, less patience in her body language, a willingness to walk away from situations that the original Gamora might have stayed to resolve. Her integration into the Ravagers, a community she chose rather than was assigned, parallels the Guardians' found family structure while remaining distinct, suggesting that Gamora found belonging on her own terms in a timeline the audience never witnessed. Her repeated rejections of Quill's advances are not cruelty but honesty, a refusal to perform emotional labor for a man she does not know simply because a version of her from another timeline loved him. The film's respect for this Gamora's autonomy, never punishing her for not reciprocating Quill's feelings, never suggesting she owes him affection, represents a mature approach to romantic closure that most blockbusters lack the courage to attempt. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions Nebula as the team's emotional infrastructure. The character whose history of abuse has equipped her with a practical compassion that recognizes suffering and responds with action rather than sentiment. Her decision to carry Rocket's unconscious body through dangerous situations, her arm transforming into a stretcher, externalizes her internal transformation from destroyer to protector. A woman who was rebuilt as a weapon, choosing to use her modifications for care. Karen Gillan's performance captures Nebula's growth without erasing her edges, the character remaining blunt and occasionally harsh even as her actions demonstrate profound love, a depiction of healing that does not require personality erasure. Her partnership with Drax during the rescue of the children on the High Evolutionary ship reveals a functional co-parenting dynamic that neither character would have been capable of in earlier films, their shared trauma producing not competition but complementary caregiving. Nebula's final decision to remain on Nowhere and build a community rather than continue adventuring completes an arc that began with a woman who only knew how to destroy worlds and ends with a woman who creates homes. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 finally grants Drax the Destroyer the fatherhood he has mourned since his introduction, not through resurrection of his dead family, but through the arrival of children who need exactly the protection he is uniquely qualified to provide. Dave Bautista's performance in the scenes where Drax calms frightened children draws on a gentleness that has always existed beneath the character's literal-minded exterior, a nurturing instinct that was buried under grief and rage but never extinguished. His ability to communicate with children, speaking to them at their level without condescension, reveals an emotional intelligence that his difficulties with adult social cues have obscured, suggesting that Drax's trauma specifically impacts his adult relationships while leaving his capacity for childcare intact. The moment where he carries a rescued child on his shoulders, the child's fear transformed into wonder, represents the final healing of a wound that has defined Drax for 3 films, the father without children finally becoming a father again. Bautista's reported insistence that Drax receive meaningful closure rather than continued comic relief demonstrates an actor's deep understanding of his character's needs, and the film honors that understanding by giving Drax the ending he deserves. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops Mantis's departure as an act of self-definition. The empath who has spent her existence feeling others' feelings finally choosing to discover what her own feelings might be when not filtered through the needs of those around her. Her decision to leave with the Abelisks, creatures whose emotions she can understand and influence, represents a middle step between complete isolation and the enmeshment she experienced with Ego and the Guardians, a graduated independence that honors her need for connection while prioritizing her need for autonomy. Palm Clementi's performance in Mantis's final scenes carries a tentative joy, the uncertainty of someone embarking on a journey without a destination, armed only with curiosity and the knowledge that she can survive on her own. The film validates her departure as necessary and healthy rather than abandonment, the other Guardians expressing sadness, but not guilt, understanding that love sometimes means supporting a friend's need to leave. Mantis's arc, often overshadowed by the louder personalities around her, is quietly revolutionary, a character who was literally created to help others sleep finding her own wakefulness. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 handles Groot's continued growth with visual inventiveness. His adolescent form a gangly intermediate stage between the adorable infant of Volume 2 and the towering adult audiences remember, his powers developing in unpredictable directions that reflect his ongoing maturation. The character design for this Groot emphasizes his physical capability while retaining the expressive face that allows audiences to read emotions from bark and moss, Vin Diesel's three-word vocabulary modulated through increasingly sophisticated inflection and timing. Groot's protective instincts, previously expressed through violence against enemies, now manifest as extending limbs that snatch allies from danger and create barriers that shield the vulnerable, a defensive rather than offensive approach to heroism. The moment when audiences suddenly understand his final, "I am Groot," as "I love you guys," represents the culmination of a linguistic joke that has run through multiple films. The punchline transformed into a declaration of family that retroactively reinterprets every previous utterance. This reveal, breaking the fourth wall by granting the audience a comprehension the characters do not share, positions viewers as part of the family, included in the communication in a way that diegetic characters cannot be. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 introduces Adam Warlock's arc as compressed but suggestive, a being of immense power and minimal emotional development whose journey from weapon to potential hero occurs in the margins of the main narrative. While Poulter's physical transformation into the golden-skinned Warlock represents one of the most committed superhero physiques in recent cinema, his body is special effect achieved through practical dedication rather than digital enhancement, grounding the fantastical character in tangible reality. Warlock's attack on the Guardians in the film's opening, driven by his mother Aisha's commands rather than personal malice, establishes him as a tool being wielded rather than a villain choosing evil, a distinction that opens space for his eventual redemption. His decision to save Quill's life after Groot spares him, an act of mercy he does not fully understand but recognizes as significant, suggests a capacity for moral growth that the film declines to fully explore, leaving his future as a question rather than an answer. The mid-credit scene's inclusion of Warlock on the new Guardians team positions him as a work in progress, a godlike toddler who will need the found family structure as much as Rocket once did. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 presents Cosmo the Space Dog as more than comic relief, her telekinetic abilities serving crucial narrative functions, while her desire for validation echoes the film's central theme of creatures seeking recognition from those they serve. Maria Bakalova's vocal performance, carrying a Russian accent that references Cosmo's comic book origin as a Soviet space program experiment, adds specificity to a character who could easily have been a generic, cute animal sidekick. Cosmo's repeated requests to be called a good dog are played for gentle comedy, but carry the weight of a being who was launched into space and abandoned, whose loyalty survived circumstances that would have broken a less faithful creature. Her telekinetic tunneling during the rescue operation, creating escape routes for children and animals, transforms her from mascot to essential team member, her powers deployed with a creativity that respects her capabilities. The film's treatment of Cosmo, never mocking her desire for approval, granting her moments of genuine heroism, reflects the trilogy's consistent ethic that all beings deserve dignity, regardless of species or perceived utility. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features Kraglin's mastery of Yondu's fin and arrow as a subplot about legacy and competence. Sean Gunn's performance balancing comedy with genuine pathos as a character who has inherited great power without the training to use it safely. Kraglin's repeated failures with the arrow, sending it into walls, losing control, endangering allies, are played for laughs but grounded in real frustration, a depiction of the gap between inheritance and ability that most legacy narratives elide. His eventual success during the climactic rescue, the arrow finally responding to his whistle with the precision Yondu demonstrated, represents the completion of a mentorship that began with abuse and ended with love, a student finally worthy of his teacher's signature technique. The moment of Kraglin's triumph is also a moment of grief, his shriek of victory echoing Yondu's whistle in a way that acknowledges absence even as it celebrates achievement. This subplot honors Michael Rooker's character without resorting to flashbacks or ghostly visitations, keeping Yondu present through the legacy he left rather than supernatural intervention. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops the relationship between the Guardians and the rescued abelisks as a practical demonstration of the film's thesis about the difference between nature and conditioning. Creatures initially presented as monsters revealing themselves to be victims of abuse capable of loyalty and affection. Mantis's empathic communication with the abelisks uncovers their fear and pain beneath the aggression, her powers functioning as a bridge between species that enables understanding where violence would only produce more trauma. The abelisk's decision to help the Guardians escape, carrying them through collapsing corridors, represents a choice rather than domestication, creatures exercising agency in allying with those who treated them with respect. Their eventual departure with Mantis suggests a future where these beings, freed from exploitation, might discover what they want to become rather than what they were forced to be. This subplot extends the film's empathy to creatures who lack humanoid characteristics, arguing that the capacity for relationship and moral choice extends beyond the anthropomorphic. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the high evolutionary's character design, the regal bearing, the cultured accent, the theatrical delivery. As a mask that conceals monstrous insecurity, Chukwudi Iwuji's performance revealing the pathetic need beneath the god complex. His obsession with Rocket's brain, the one creation that exceeded his expectations and therefore escaped his control, reveals that his cruelty is driven not by confidence but by terror of inadequacy, the fear that his creations might surpass their creator. The mask he wears over his mauled face literalizes his performative humanity, the scarred visage beneath representing the ugliness that his cultured demeanor attempts to hide. His casual execution of subordinates who question or fail him demonstrates an inability to tolerate any challenge to his self-image, the fragility of an ego that must eliminate all contrary evidence. The film declines to provide him with a tragic backstory or sympathetic motivation, understanding that some evil requires no explanation, that the desire to play God is motivation enough, and that humanizing certain villains would be a moral failure rather than a narrative sophistication. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 navigates the challenge of concluding character arcs that span multiple films and directors by maintaining a clear focus on the specific dynamics established in Gunn's previous entries, while acknowledging growth that occurred elsewhere. The film references the events of Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame only as necessary backstory, trusting audiences to remember or infer rather than pausing for exposition, a respect for viewer intelligence that keeps the pacing tight despite the complex continuity. The alternate Gamera's presence, a consequence of Endgame's time travel mechanics, is handled as an established fact rather than a plot point requiring explanation, the film more interested in the emotional implications than the sci-fi logistics. This approach to continuity, acknowledging the shared universe without being enslaved by it, allows Volume 3 to function as a satisfying conclusion to the Guardians trilogy specifically rather than a middle chapter in a larger saga. The film's independence from MCU connectivity requirements, a freedom Gunn earned through his departure to DC, results in a story that prioritizes its own characters over franchise obligations. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features a visual palette that distinguishes each location through deliberate color choices, the cold blues and sterile whites of Orgacorp contrasting with the warm, saturated chaos of Nowhere and the false nostalgia of Counter-Earth's 1980s aesthetic. Henry Braham's cinematography captures practical sets and actor performances with a clarity that grounds the cosmic setting in tangible reality, the large-format red cameras providing depth and texture that serve the film's emotional realism. The one-take action sequence, achieved through meticulous choreography and digital stitching, represents the trilogy's technical peak, the camera flowing seamlessly between characters as they battle through the corridors of Arret. This sequence functions as both a technical showcase and a narrative statement, the continuous movement expressing the team's interdependence through form as well as content. The visual effects work on Rocket, a character who must convey nuanced emotion through CGI raccoon features, represents the state-of-the-art in digital character creation. Bradley Cooper's vocal performance, integrated with animation that captures micro-expressions most live-action actors would struggle to produce. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 incorporates John Murphy's original score as an essential element of the film's emotional architecture, his themes providing continuity while establishing new musical identities for the trilogy's concluding chapter. Murphy's central theme for Rocket carries a mournful, ascending quality that suggests both the pain of the past and the possibility of transcendence, a musical arc that mirrors the character's psychological journey. The score's integration with the licensed soundtrack creates a sonic texture that honors the trilogy's established identity while adapting to the more serious register of this installment. The acoustic cover of Radiohead's Creep during Rocket's near-death experience transforms a song about self-loathing into a moment of acceptance, the stripped-down arrangement revealing vulnerability in lyrics that the original's ironic delivery obscured. Florence and the Machine's Dog Days Are Over, playing over the epilogue montage, functions as both celebration and benediction, a promise that the happiness the characters have found is real and earned. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions the rescue of children and animals as the film's moral climax. a sequence that replaces the traditional superhero boss fight with a humanitarian crisis response that measures heroism in lives saved rather than enemies defeated. The Guardians split up not to defeat the High Evolutionary in combat, but to extract everyone they can before his ship explodes, their heroism expressed through protection rather than destruction. Drax, Nebula, and Mantis befriending the Abelisks, and using them as escape vehicles transforms potential obstacles into allies through empathy, a practical demonstration of the film's argument that understanding is more effective than violence. Cosmo's telekinetic tunneling creates escape routes for the caged animals, her powers deployed in service of the vulnerable rather than against enemies. The image of the team ferrying cages of terrified creatures and bewildered children through collapsing corridors, their own safety secondary to their mission of rescue, refutes the High Evolutionary's ideology more powerfully than any physical defeat could. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gives Rocket the moral victory of sparing the High Evolutionary's life, a choice that frustrates revenge expectations, but completes the character's psychological arc by demonstrating independence from his creator's values. Killing the High Evolutionary would satisfy audience desire for cathartic violence, but it would also confirm that Rocket remains trapped in the cycle his abuser established, responding to cruelty with cruelty rather than transcending it. Rocket's decision to let his creator live, witnessed by the memory of Lila's approving presence, represents a declaration of moral autonomy, a refusal to let the High Evolutionary determine his actions, even in the moment of ultimate power. This choice is not forgiveness. The High Evolutionary is dragged away by his own creations to face consequences, not absolved, but rather indifference, the abuser rendered irrelevant to the survivor's ongoing life. The film's willingness to prioritize psychological authenticity over audience bloodlust represents the maturation of superhero storytelling, a recognition that true victory over trauma is not destruction of the abuser, but liberation from the abuser's influence. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 concludes Peter Quill's arc with his return to Earth and reunion with his grandfather, a full-circle journey that began when a boy was abducted from a Missouri hospital parking lot and told his mother's death meant he had no home left. Chris Pratt's performance in the final scene, a man terrified to knock on an old man's door, unsure if he deserves a family that exists outside of crisis, grounds the cosmic epic in the simple, profound act of coming home. The grandfather's matter-of-fact acceptance, pouring cereal as if his long-lost grandson's appearance is surprising but not unwelcome, represents the unconditional family love that Quill has been seeking across the galaxy. This homecoming is not a defeat or regression, but an acknowledgement that healing requires confronting the wounds we ran from, that maturity means returning to unresolved grief rather than fleeing it. The film argues that Quill had to lose everything, including his identity as Star-Lord, before he could find the courage to be Peter Jason Quill again. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops the theme of bodily autonomy through its depiction of the High Evolutionary's experiments, which strip creatures of consent over their own physical forms in the name of improvement. Rocket's cybernetic implants, Lila's mechanical arms, Teefs's wheels, and Floor's facial modifications are all violations imposed without consent, permanent reminders of a creator who viewed his subjects as objects to be optimized rather than beings with rights. The film's insistence that these modifications are traumatic rather than empowering distinguishes it from the transhumanist fantasies of many superhero narratives, arguing that the right to determine one's own body is fundamental and that its violation constitutes a profound moral harm regardless of the violator's intentions. The contrast between these imposed modifications and the character's eventual acceptance of their altered bodies, Rocket claiming his raccoon identity, Nebula using her cybernetics for care, suggests that the harm is not in modification itself, but in the lack of consent and the contempt that motivated it. The film extends this theme to its critique of animal testing, where creatures are subjected to procedures without understanding or agreement, their bodies treated as raw material for scientific ambition. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 explores the concept of creation ethics through the contrast between the High Evolutionary's biological engineering and the Guardian's emotional investment in each other. The villain creates life through science but destroys it through negligence. The heroes create family through choice and sustain it through sacrifice. This parallel argues that the act of making something alive carries with it an ongoing obligation of care, a responsibility that extends beyond the moment of creation into the entire lifespan of the created. The High Evolutionary's willingness to discard his creations when they fail to meet his standards is the moral failure that defines him, while the Guardians' refusal to abandon each other is the moral achievement that redeems them. The film extends this argument beyond the narrative to implicate real-world systems of animal experimentation, factory farming, and eugenics, using the superhero genre to critique institutionalized cruelty. When Rocket spares his creator, he models a different relationship between creator and creation, one where the creation's moral choices are independent of the creator's values. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 presents the High Evolutionary's Counter-Earth genocide as a horrifying escalation of villainy that dwarfs even Thanos' destruction in its pettiness. A planetary population eliminated not for philosophical reasons, but because their creator found them aesthetically displeasing. The sequence is rendered in horrifying wide shots that show neighborhoods, families, and entire civilizations obliterated in minutes. The scale of the atrocity communicated through visual storytelling rather than exposition. This sequence explicitly parallels real-world genocides and eugenics movements, the language of imperfect specimens and failed experiments, echoing rhetoric that has justified historical atrocities. The fact that the High Evolutionary commits this genocide casually, without visible emotion beyond frustration, makes the sequence more disturbing than any emotional outburst could, because it reveals that for him mass death is simply pest control. The film refuses to soften this horror with humor or heroic intervention, allowing the genocide to occur and forcing audiences to sit with the reality of what has happened, a narrative choice that respects the gravity of the subject matter. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 uses the Zune MP3 player as an evolving symbol of Quill's connection to Earth and his emotional state, the device representing both his arrested relationship with his home planet and his acceptance of the gift Yondu gave him. The Zune's presence in this film, filled with music from the 1980s and 1990s that Quill never experienced firsthand, represents a relationship with Earth that is frozen in time, curated through media rather than lived experience. His eventual decision to return to Earth completes this symbolic arc, the device that played father and son during Yondu's funeral now having played the soundtrack to Quill's final adventure. Passing the Zune to Rocket represents a handing off of not just captaincy, but the emotional burden of carrying Earth's music across the stars, a legacy that connects the original Guardians to whatever team follows. The Zune's final song, playing over the epilogue, becomes a diegetic farewell to the audience, the music that defined the trilogy accompanying the characters toward their separate futures. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 treats Nowhere as a living community rather than a static location. The severed celestial head transformed from a lawless mining colony into a bustling refuge that embodies everything the High Evolutionary despises. The visual design of Nowhere emphasizes its chaotic diversity, the accumulated detritus of countless species coexisting in a space that was never meant to house life, but has been reclaimed by it. This setting functions as a counter-argument to the High Evolutionary's sterile vision, a proof of concept that messy, unplanned communities can thrive precisely because of their imperfections rather than despite them. Nebula and Drax's decision to remain on Nowhere and raise the rescued children positions this unlikely location as a site of future hope, a place where the next generation will grow up protected from the cruelty that shaped their rescuers. The film's investment in Nowhere as a place worth defending and building upon argues for the value of imperfect communities, a rejection of the utopian impulse that requires starting over rather than improving what exists. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features the final appearances of Sylvester Stallone's Stakar Ogord and the original Ravager crew in a cameo that honors the connective tissue between Gunn's films while demonstrating the extended network of allies the Guardians have built. Their presence during the rescue operation serves as a visual acknowledgement that the found family ethos extends beyond the core team to a larger community of spacefaring misfits who show up when needed. This cameo also provides closure for the Ravager storyline that began in Volume 2's post-credits scenes, a loose thread tied off with efficiency rather than extended development. The Ravager's participation in the rescue demonstrates the practical benefits of the Guardians' approach to relationships, their network of allies proving essential when the stakes require more than the core team can provide alone. This brief appearance respects the audience's investment in these characters without demanding that they receive full arcs, trusting that their presence itself is sufficient payoff. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 treats the destruction of the High Evolutionary's ship as a consequence of the rescue mission rather than a strategic objective, the Guardians' goal being extraction rather than demolition. The ship's destruction results from chaos and the High Evolutionary's own hubris, not a calculated strike, maintaining the film's moral distinction between protective violence and creative destruction. When the ship finally explodes, it takes with it the physical infrastructure of torture, but not the memory, a realistic acknowledgement that destroying the apparatus of cruelty does not erase its effects on survivors. The film's refusal to present the ship's destruction as triumphant. The focus remains on the rescued, not the destroyed, maintains its moral framework of protection over vengeance. This choice aligns with the trilogy's consistent ethic that the point of heroism is saving lives, not defeating villains, and that the latter is only valuable insofar as it enables the former. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops Rocket's acceptance of his raccoon identity as a profound moment of self-recognition, the character finally claiming a label that was weaponized against him and transforming it into a source of pride. The journey from defensively insisting, "I'm not a raccoon," to silently acknowledging his reflection represents the psychological work of embracing the self that trauma tried to destroy. Bradley Cooper's vocal performance in the film's quieter moments conveys a character finally at peace with what he is, because what he is has proven worthy of love and leadership. This acceptance extends to his assumption of the captaincy, a role he initially rejects because he still sees himself as the damaged experiment who got his friends killed. When Rocket finally looks at the new team roster and accepts his role, it completes a transformation that began with a caged raccoon who only wanted to build a sky and ends with a captain who will ensure no one under his command ever feels caged again. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 positions the mid-credits scene's new Guardians lineup as a promise that the franchise concept can continue while acknowledging that the specific chemistry of the original team cannot be replicated. Rocket leading adolescent Groot, Kraglin with his mastered arrow, Cosmo the telekinetic dog, Adam Warlock and his pet Blurp, and the rescued Phyla suggests a future that could be fun but feels intentionally less mythic than what came before. The scene's lighter tone, a deliberate contrast to the emotional weight of the preceding 2+ hours, allows audiences to imagine further adventures without demanding that they be as emotionally significant as the story that just concluded. This is not a weakness but a conscious lowering of stakes, a permission for future storytellers to find their own identity rather than attempting to recreate Gunn's alchemy. The new team's composition, a mix of established characters, new additions, and comic relief, provides enough personality to sustain interest while leaving room for development that the film itself does not attempt to provide. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 delivers a post-credits scene that reveals Peter Quill eating cereal with his grandfather. A domestic image so mundane and warm that it reframes the entire galactic saga as a very long detour on the way to breakfast with family. The conversation about the neighbor mowing the lawn grounds Quill's return in the specific textures of ordinary life. The cosmic hero reinserted into a world where the biggest concern is lawn maintenance rather than planetary destruction. This scene, refusing to set up future installments or tease crossover events, is James Gunn's final statement on the character he has shepherded across 3 films. The space adventurer was always a small-town boy who missed his mom, and returning to that original wound with the courage to heal it is a braver act than any battle. The scene's quietness, its willingness to end not with a bang, but with cereal, represents the culmination of the trilogy's commitment to character over spectacle. Quill's grandfather's matter-of-fact acceptance, no dramatic reunion, just an offer of breakfast, suggests that family love, when it is real, does not require explanation or apology, only presence. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 handles the death of the High Evolutionary's recorder Vim as a compressed warning about enabling abusive authority. Miriam Shore's character progressing from loyal servant to horrified witness to corpse in a few scenes that illustrate the fate of those who serve monsters. Her execution, quick and unceremonious, occurs when she questions the High Evolutionary's methods, demonstrating that his tolerance for dissent is zero, and that even the most devoted subordinates are disposable the moment they cease to validate. This subplot functions as a cautionary tale about complicity, suggesting that those who enable cruelty out of loyalty or ambition will eventually be consumed by the systems they support. Vim's arc, while brief, contributes to the film's larger argument about institutional evil and the individuals who sustain it through obedience. Her death is not presented as tragedy. She was, after all, complicit in atrocity, but as inevitability, the logical endpoint of serving a master who views all life as provisional. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 develops the concept of home as a portable, relational construct, with nowhere serving as the physical manifestation of the idea that home is wherever care is provided and community is built. The severed head of a dead god, drifting through space and populated by refugees, is as far from a traditional home as imaginable, yet it becomes the site of the film's most stable domestic arrangements. Nebula and Drax choosing to remain on Nowhere to raise children suggests that the location matters less than the relationships it houses, that home is created through commitment rather than geography. This argument extends the trilogy's found family theme into its logical conclusion, suggesting that belonging is not something you find, but something you build, and that the building never stops. The film's final images of Nowhere, bustling with rescued children and new possibilities, present a vision of home that is dynamic and evolving rather than static and nostalgic. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 features the Guardians' argument about their various personal dramas while navigating life-threatening situations, a verbal chaos that captures the trilogy's signature tonal blend of interpersonal comedy and genuine peril. These arguments, about Gamera's coldness, about Mantis's independence, about who is allowed to sacrifice themselves, are not interruptions of the action but the action itself, the team's dysfunction and love operating simultaneously in a dynamic that has defined the Guardians since their first prison break. Gunn understands that these characters express affection through bickering, and the film allows their final mission together to be filled with the same exasperated love that has always characterized their interactions. The arguments also serve to process the emotional stakes of the mission, each conflict revealing something about the characters' fears and hopes that action alone could not communicate. This approach to character development through conflict rather than exposition demonstrates the trilogy's mastery of showing rather than telling.